Ten, isu, du, Marlene, noun, tuit kunkush, kayafam, chew, pangko, Clifton, Clifton, kun Clifton, kun, du, Clifton, ko, artu, bo, bang, prow, Clifton, Kutrung list. Clifton, ko, Clifton, cat ten kak, Ida muku chihon, Harmon, Bamia, Awaz, Louis Amorient Gluk, Theras, Thera, Babalaiga, Doom Ladi Madi, No Waz, Dinghel, No Wan, Rukan, Tenhel Morian, Alaz, Somia, Thingyen, Winona, Hong Som, Xavier, Contre. The day my son was born was the day I understood what it meant to be truly alone. I was lying in that hospital bed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sweating through a gown that didn't fit right, gripping the bed rail through contractions because the nurse had stepped out and my husband wasn't there. He hadn't answered a single one of my calls. When he finally walked through that door at 11:47 in the morning, smelling like coffee and something sharper underneath it, our son had already been in the world for 3 hours. I remember thinking, he made it. Thank God he made it. Thank God he made it. I remember reaching for him with my free arm. He didn't take my hand. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at our son lying against my chest. This tiny, red-faced, perfect boy, and his expression was something I had never seen on his face before. Not happiness, not relief, something cold and analytical like he was doing arithmetic. He doesn't look like me, he said. Just like that. No hello. No, are you okay? No, I'm sorry I wasn't here. He doesn't look like me. I laughed because I thought he was joking. Clifton, he's 3 hours old. He looks like a sweet potato. I want a DNA test. Behind him, in the doorway, stood his mother. She had her arms crossed and a small, satisfied smile on her face like she'd been waiting a long time to stand exactly there. His father was behind her. He didn't smile. He looked at our son for a long moment, then he looked at me, and he turned away. I didn't understand why that mattered to me at the time. I was too exhausted, too blindsided by my husband's words to pay much attention to the way his father turned his face toward the wall. But I would think about that moment again and again in the months that followed, the way he turned away, the way his hands gripped the doorframe just a little too hard. Some things you don't understand until much later. And some things, when you finally understand them, make you wish you never had to. My name is Marlene. I'm 64 years old. I live in a small house in Broken Arrow with a vegetable garden out back and a cat named Pudding who knocks things off the counter at 3 in the morning. My life now is quiet in the way that only comes after years of noise. I didn't get here easily. I got here by surviving something I wasn't supposed to survive, and by refusing again and again and again to stay down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in Muskogee. My mother cleaned houses for a living, and my father drove a beer delivery truck until his back gave out. And then he just sat in a recliner and watched baseball and drank the product. We weren't fancy people. We weren't even particularly hopeful people. But my mother had a saying. She repeated so often it became part of the furniture of my mind. A woman who knows her own worth doesn't need anyone to tell her what she's worth. I carried that with me everywhere, even when I forgot to believe it. I met Clifton Aldridge when I was 31 years old at a fundraiser for the children's hospital where I worked as a pediatric nurse. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and rearranged it without touching anything. Tall, broad-shouldered, easy smile, the sort of confidence that doesn't come from effort, but from never having been told no. His family owned 3 car dealerships in the Tulsa area and a commercial real estate portfolio that his grandfather had started in the 1950s. Old Oklahoma money, which is its own particular flavor of old money, blunter than the East Coast kind, louder at church, meaner about the edges. He told me I had the most honest eyes he'd ever seen. I should have asked him what he meant by that. I should have asked him what he meant by that. I should have asked a lot of questions I didn't ask. We dated for 14 months. He was attentive and generous and funny in a dry, understated way I loved. When he proposed, I cried happy tears in a restaurant while people at neighboring tables clapped. My mother cried too, but she called me the next morning and said quietly, "Baby, you know I love you," but his mother didn't shake my hand at dinner. I told her she was imagining things. I was wrong. His mother, Ida, never called me by my name, not once in 4 years of marriage. She called me the nurse when speaking to others, and dear to my face in a tone that made the word feel like an insult. She had wanted Clifton to marry a woman named Deanna Pruitt, a second-generation oil heiress from Bartlesville who played tennis and chaired charity committees. Instead, he had brought home a nurse from Muskogee whose father drank. His father, Harmon, was different, or so I thought at first. He was quieter than Ida, more measured. He asked me questions about my work, nodded when I answered, remembered details from previous conversations. I thought he was kind. I thought he respected me. I was wrong about that too. The first year of marriage was hard in the way that most first years are hard. The friction of two lives trying to become one, the small negotiations and surrenders. Clifton worked long hours. He traveled frequently. I kept working at the hospital because I loved it and because staying in that enormous house in South Tulsa all day made me feel like I was slowly disappearing. When I got pregnant, I thought things would change. I thought, naively, that a baby would give us both something solid to stand on together. For a while, it seemed like it might. Clifton bought a crib before I was 8 weeks along. He talked about coaching Little League. He called his mother from the driveway when we got home from the first ultrasound, and I stood in the kitchen listening to him sound genuinely happy for the first time in months. Then came the family Christmas party. It was held at the Aldridge house, the big one out in Jenks, the one with the circular driveway and the fountain that Ida kept covered with a tarp in winter. Cousins and aunts and business associates crowded every room. I was 6 months pregnant, my back aching, wearing a red dress that no longer buttoned properly at the top. I felt conspicuous in the way that only pregnant women and people who don't belong can feel conspicuous. Harmon found me in the kitchen around 9 o'clock when the party noise had reached that particular pitch, where you can't quite hear what anyone is saying. He was holding 2 glasses of red wine. "Merry Christmas, Marlene," he said. It was the warmest he'd ever sounded. I had this shipped in from a vineyard in Napa. It's non-alcoholic. They make a wonderful version. You should try it. I hesitated. I had been careful about everything for 6 months. No soft cheeses, no lunch meat, no cold cuts or sushi or hot tubs or secondhand smoke. "Are you sure it's non-alcoholic?" He smiled. "I had it specially ordered. Half the family is on medication. We always have a few bottles." I took the glass. I took a sip. It tasted like wine. Rich, dark, slightly sweet. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up in a guest bedroom with my shoes still on and a headache behind my eyes like a railroad spike. It was morning. The party sounds were gone. The house was quiet. My phone showed 14 missed calls from Clifton. I told myself I had overdone it. I told myself the noise and the standing and the late hour had simply caught up with me. I told myself this for months afterward, in the spaces between doctor's appointments and baby showers and Clifton growing increasingly distant, and Ida making pointed comments about the due date that I couldn't quite decode. Something in my body knew, something deep and old, an animal knew, but I had no language for it, and no one to tell, and a baby coming in 12 weeks. My son arrived 3 weeks early, healthy and screaming, while I labored alone. And then Clifton walked in and said what he said, and everything I'd been telling myself I was imagining turned into something I could no longer ignore. The hospital social worker was a woman named Bet, small, 50-ish, with reading glasses, on a chain in a manner that was brisk but not unkind. She came to my room the second evening after the confrontation, after Clifton had taken his mother and left, after the nurses had witnessed enough that someone apparently felt they needed to get Bet involved. "Your husband has filed for a formal paternity dispute," she told me. "That means the hospital is required to document certain things. He was never here, I said. I was here alone. I was here the whole time and he wasn't. She nodded like she'd heard this before because she probably had. Is there anyone I can call for you? There was no one. My mother had died 2 years earlier. I had a brother in Phoenix I spoke to twice a year. I had colleagues at the hospital where I worked, but none. I felt close enough to call at midnight with my newborn son in my arms and my marriage in flames. No, I said. There's no one. Bad sat down in the chair beside my bed and looked at me for a moment over her reading glasses. There's a legal aid clinic that works specifically with women in family law disputes, she said. They're good. They help someone I know. She wrote a name and number on the back of a hospital business card and pressed it into my hand. I looked at the name, Eloise Drummond-esque. I called her the next morning. Eloise Drummond was not what I expected. I had pictured someone soft, someone patient, someone who would hold my hand while I cried. What I got was a 58-year-old black woman from Tulsa who had been practicing family law for 30 years, wore her hair natural and her suits impeccably, and whose office had a framed needlepoint on the wall that read, "They didn't expect you to still be standing. Stand anyway." She listened to everything. She didn't flinch once. The pregnancy timeline, she said when I'd finished, walk me through it again. I walked her through it. My last period. The positive test, the first ultrasound, and the dates the doctor had confirmed, the Christmas party, the morning after. Eloise was quiet for a long moment. What you're describing, the sudden fatigue, the memory gap, the physical symptoms the next day, that's consistent with a drugged drink. I stared at her. You were already pregnant at the Christmas party, she said. So whatever was in that drink couldn't have affected your son's paternity. But that's not the point. The point is that someone gave you something without your knowledge or consent. And if we can prove that, this entire situation changes. I hadn't let myself think those words. Drugged. Without your consent. I had been so busy surviving the days that I hadn't let myself name what had happened. I started crying. Not the quiet kind. The kind that comes from somewhere you didn't know you were holding. Eloise pushed a box of tissues across her desk. She didn't say anything while I cried. When I was done, she said, "Okay, here's what we do." The first thing she did was request my full medical records from the hospital, including blood work from my admission the morning my son was born. I delivered early enough after the Christmas party that there was a possibility, a small one, that something might still show up in the residuals if we knew what to look for. The second thing was the paternity test. Eloise moved fast. The results came back in 11 days. My son was Clifton's. Biologically, unambiguously his. The math of it was simple. The conception had happened months before the Christmas party, exactly when the ultrasound had always indicated. Clifton's suspicion had been built on nothing, on whispers from his mother and a convenient story about timing that didn't hold up against the facts. I expected relief. Instead, I felt something quieter and stranger. Because while the results cleared my name, they did nothing to explain what Harmon had put in my glass. Eloise had a theory. She'd seen something like this before, she told me, in a case she couldn't discuss by name. A powerful family. A woman who didn't fit. A drink at a gathering. She believed that Harmon's motivation was not what I'd first feared. It was control. He wanted leverage. He wanted something he could hold over me or use to destabilize the marriage on his own terms, or both. Men like that didn't always need a reason that made sense to the rest of us. They just needed to feel like they owned the room. But I need more than a theory, she said. I need someone who's been in that room before. She found her. It took 6 weeks and a private investigator who charged us a fee I paid on a credit card I was hoping not to think about. Her name was Willa. She was 43 years old, living in Tahlequah, working as a bookkeeper, raising 2 daughters alone. She had worked as an office manager at one of the Aldridge dealerships 8 years earlier, before she was let go without explanation, and before she signed a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a severance check large enough to matter to a woman on a bookkeeper's salary. When we showed up at her door on a Tuesday evening, she looked at me for a long time before she said anything. I wondered when somebody would come, she said. I wondered if anybody would come. Willa's story wasn't identical to mine, but the shape of it was the same. A company gathering, a drink pressed into her hand by Harmon himself, a gap in her memory, waking up disoriented, going to her direct supervisor who told her she must have had too much to drink, who then told HR, who then presented her with the NDA and the check. I was ashamed, she said. I still don't know what I thought. I thought somehow it was my fault for being there, for accepting the drink, for not being more careful. Her voice was steady, but her hands were wrapped tight around her coffee mug. I have 2 daughters. I think about them all the time. I think about whether someone will do this to them someday. You don't have to sign anything now, Eloise told her. You don't have to decide anything tonight. But if you're ever willing to talk to investigators, your voice matters. Willa looked at me. He hurt you too. He tried to, I said. I think that was the intention. She nodded slowly. Then yes, when the time comes. What we didn't expect was what Clifton did next. He had moved back to his parents' house after the hospital. He was filing for divorce and had retained a lawyer who was a fraternity brother of his from OU. I had expected the process to be ugly and prolonged. I expected Ida to make it her purpose in life. What I did not expect was my husband calling me from a parking lot at 10 in the morning on a Thursday, his voice stripped down to something I hadn't heard from him in years. I need to show you something, he said. We met at a diner in Jenks, far enough from his parents' usual orbit. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. There were hollows under his eyes and a tightness around his mouth that I recognized from the years when his father had been hard on him, before Clifton had learned to pretend it didn't affect him. He slid a manila envelope across the table. I was looking for the business insurance documents, he said. I needed them for the divorce proceedings. I found these instead. I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of wire transfers, payments made from a shell account connected to the Aldridge Family Trust, going back 19 years. Women's names. Amounts that ranged from $8,000 to $65,000. Notations coded in a system that didn't mean anything to me, but which Eloise would later determine corresponded to dates of company gatherings, family parties, and holiday events. 7 women. 19 years. Harmon Aldridge had been doing this since before I ever set foot in Tulsa. I confronted him, Clifton said. His voice was very flat. I drove to the house and I confronted him directly. I showed him the transfers. I asked him what he had done to you. He stopped. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth for a moment. He told me you were nobody. He told me women like you, women who marry up, are always looking for angles. He said I was being sentimental. I didn't say anything. He said he was protecting the family. Clifton laughed, a short, broken sound. Protecting the family? That's what he called it. What are you going to do? I asked. He looked at me. His eyes were red. I already did it. I gave copies of everything to your lawyer this morning before I called you. I left originals in a sealed envelope with my attorney with instructions to hand them to the DA if anything happens to either of us. I sat with that for a moment. Why? Because he's my father, Clifton said. And he did this, and if I don't do something about it, then I'm just the next version of him. He looked down at his coffee. I was never a good husband to you. I know that. I can't fix that, but I can do this. It wasn't reconciliation. I don't want to make it sound like a reunion. We were done as a couple, and we both knew it, and neither of us pretended otherwise. But in that diner booth in Jenks, I looked at my husband, and I saw a man choosing something hard over something easy, and that mattered to me. Even then, even after everything, Eloise filed a formal criminal complaint with the Tulsa County DA's office 4 days later. She had the wire transfers, she had Willa, she had my medical records, which showed a trace compound in my blood work consistent with the sedative that had not been prescribed to me. She had Clifton's testimony. And 3 weeks after we filed, 2 more women came forward, both of whom had been employed by the Aldridge organization at different points, both of whom had signed NDAs that Eloise argued had been obtained under duress and were therefore unenforceable. 4 women. 2 decades. One man who had spent his entire adult life believing that money and position meant that consequences were for other people. The DA's office moved. Not immediately. There were weeks of waiting, of depositions, of Ida giving a television interview in which she called me a troubled woman with a grudge against a successful family, of Harmon's attorneys trying to discredit Willa's testimony on technical grounds. But they moved. The trial lasted 9 days. I testified for almost 4 hours. I told them about the drink, about waking up with my shoes on, about the months I spent telling myself I was imagining things, because that's what women like me learn to do. We learn to doubt ourselves before we doubt the powerful men around us, because doubting ourselves is safer and quieter and doesn't cost us anything, or so we think. Harmon Aldridge sat at the defense table in a suit that cost more than my car, and he looked old in a way I hadn't noticed before. Not frail, just diminished. Like something had been removed from him that had always been the biggest part of him, the certainty that he would never have to answer for anything. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Guilty. 4 counts of drug-facilitated assault, 1 count of conspiracy. 1 count of obstruction relating to the NDA scheme, 32 years. He would be 81 when he was eligible for release. Ida divorced him the week after sentencing. She moved to a condo in Phoenix. She never spoke to me again, which suited me fine. Clifton and I finalized our divorce 6 months after the trial. He was present at every milestone in our son's life from that point forward. First steps, first words, first day of kindergarten, every school play, every soccer game he could make. DNA had said one thing. He had chosen to say something else. He was not a perfect man, and he was not a perfect father, but he showed up. In the end, that was more than I could have expected and more than some children ever get. The civil settlement funded 2 things. My son's college education, and something I'd started planning during the long months of waiting for the trial, a program I called the Tuesday Project, named for the Tuesday evening Eloise and I had knocked on Willa's door. It provides legal consultations, emergency housing referrals, and peer support specifically for women navigating family law situations involving powerful defendants and NDAs. In the past 9 years, it has served over 2,000 women across Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas. Willa runs the Tahlequah chapter. She has a framed photo on her desk. Her 2 daughters, now 19 and 22, both in college. She told me once that doing this work is the first time in 8 years she has felt like she got some of herself back. I told her I understood exactly what she meant. My son is 29 now. He's a social worker in Kansas City, working with kids in the foster care system. He knows his story. I told him everything when he was old enough to understand, because I believe that children raised on edited versions of the truth grow up to be adults who can't trust their own instincts. He deserved the whole picture. He can decide what it means to him. What it means to him, as far as I can tell, is that his mother is someone who didn't stay quiet when it would have been easier to stay quiet, and that his father was a man who chose decency over loyalty when those 2 things pointed in different directions. I think that's a reasonable inheritance. I'm 64 years old. I have a garden that produces more zucchini than I know what to do with every August. I have a cat who disapproves of me. I have former colleagues who call on Sundays and a neighbor down the street who leaves tomatoes on my porch in the summer. I have a life that is, by any measure, a good one. Some mornings I sit on my back porch with coffee before the day starts, and I think about that Christmas party, that glass of wine, that smooth, confident smile. I think about waking up with my shoes on and telling myself I was imagining things. I think about how many years I spent making myself small in that house, calling his mother by her first name, eating Thanksgiving with people who considered me a guest in my own life. And then I think about Willa, about Eloise's needlepoint on the wall, about my son calling from Kansas City to tell me about a kid he's been working with who finally got placed in a good home. I don't regret marrying Clifton. I know that sounds strange, but I think sometimes the path that breaks you is the only path that leads you to the thing you were actually supposed to do. I was supposed to be in that hospital in Tulsa with a newborn in my arms and no one in my corner. I was supposed to call Eloise. I was supposed to find Willa. I was supposed to build the Tuesday Project. Some things you don't understand until much later. And some things, when you understand them, you're glad you stayed long enough to see. I never stayed quiet. Not when it would have cost me nothing. And not when it cost me almost everything. That's the only thing I know for certain, looking back from 64. They didn't expect me to still be standing. I'm standing. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. Your support means everything to this channel. On screen right now, you'll find 2 more stories I think you'll want to hear. There's so much more on Twisted ZYN Stories, so subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. I've had a lot of years to think about what actually happened. Not just the facts of it, but the logic underneath the facts. The way one thing leads to another. The way choices accumulate slowly and quietly until they become a weight that nobody can carry forever. Harmon Aldridge spent almost 2 decades believing he was untouchable. And for almost 2 decades, he was right. The money worked. The NDAs worked. The silence of frightened women worked. Every time he walked away from what he had done without consequence, I think it must have confirmed something in him, that the rules everyone else lived by simply didn't apply to him. That's not an unusual belief among powerful men. It's just usually more durable than it turned out to be for him. What he didn't account for was Willa. He didn't account for a Tuesday evening in Tahlequah for a woman who had spent 8 years telling herself it wasn't worth it, finally deciding that it was. He didn't account for what happens when you do something unforgivable to more than one person, that eventually those people find each other, that eventually the silence breaks, not all at once, but one voice at a time. And then it doesn't matter how much money you have, because money only buys silence from people who are still afraid. And some people stop being afraid. What I think about most, though, is Clifton. I won't pretend he was a good husband. He wasn't. He was distant and absent, and he believed his mother's whispers before he believed his own wife, and there's no version of that I can excuse. But he walked into that diner in Jenks, and he slid an envelope across a table, and he chose his son over his father. That took something. I've known people, plenty of people, who couldn't have done it, who would have found a way to look the other direction and call it loyalty. Clifton called it what it was. And it cost him. It cost him his relationship with his mother, his standing in the family business, the clean, easy life he would have had if he'd just stayed quiet. He paid a real price for doing the right thing. I think that matters. I think we don't talk enough about the fact that integrity isn't free, and that knowing the cost and paying it anyway is what makes it integrity and not just convenience. I was a pediatric nurse for 22 years before all of this. And then for a long time, I was just a woman trying to keep her head above water. Now I run a program that has helped 2,000 people. I didn't plan any of that. It came directly out of the worst thing that ever happened to me. I don't know what that means exactly. I'm not sure it means anything tidy or philosophical. What I know is that I had a choice at the lowest point between letting it make me smaller and letting it make me useful. I chose useful. That's the whole of it. Willa tells her daughters that the most important thing a person can do is refuse to pretend. Refuse to pretend it didn't happen. Refuse to pretend it doesn't matter. Refuse to pretend that you are less than what you are because someone with more power than you decided to act like you were. That is the only philosophy I've ever needed. I'm 64 years old and I'm still here. So is Willa. So is my son, doing his work in Kansas City, refusing to let where he came from determine where he's going. That's what Harmon Aldridge never understood. He thought the drink and a glass could erase a woman. He thought money and time and a signature on a piece of paper could make us disappear. What he didn't know, what men like him never seem to know, is that you cannot unmake a person who has decided quietly and completely not to be unmade.